Good evening. Welcome to the International Spy Museum, to Escalation, Tracking the U.S.-Ukraine Relationship. I'm Amanda Olkey, the Director of Adult Education here at the museum. I am just so delighted with the amazing panel that we have for you tonight. It is inspired by Escalation, the new narrative podcast series from Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. This is a really great collaboration for us because the conversation will be moderated by our very own SpyCast host, Sasha Ingber. Tonight's event kicks off a series of programs and exhibitions the Spy Museum is launching this spring as the war in Ukraine enters its third year. In addition to programming, we'll be exploring this complex war, its historic origins, and the role of intelligence through two exhibits this May, an artifact exhibit here at the museum, and an online exhibition on open source intelligence and its role in the war in Ukraine. My friend Max Johnston from Goat Rodeo will be making remarks and a formal introduction of the panel in just a moment. Over to you, Max.
First off, for those of you that don't know, my name is Max Johnston. I'm an executive producer for Escalation and a creative producer at Goat Rodeo. I wanted to speak briefly about the podcast that brings us here today. It's a little show called Escalation, with an ambitious goal, and that's to chart the decades of twists and turns between the United States and Ukraine, with the ultimate goal of figuring out how we got here to this fraught political moment. Nastia, Tyler, and I, the two hosts of the show, started this process over a year ago in the winter of 2024, and we knew that this story would be essential. We knew that it would feature compelling characters and life or death stakes. But the most daunting part of making this show was that none of us knew how the story would end. We published our first episode just a couple of months ago in late February, 3 years after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Just as the relationship between the United States and Ukraine was entering its most volatile and uncertain chapter. I've thought a lot about this show as we've finished making it, and I often think back to one specific line from our first episode. In it, we summarize the U.S.-Ukraine relationship as being, quote, defined by a common enemy, but with disagreements on how to fight it. That sentence was accurate when we wrote it nearly 7 months ago. But it pains me to say that I don't know if it's true anymore, whether or not we do, in fact, have a common enemy. The implications of that are stark. They're severe for the United States, for Ukraine, and for the rest of the world. As our American headlines increasingly focus on domestic issues and debates, our attention will naturally turn inward. And it will seem easy to forget what's happening a continent away, to retreat from the impact that our country's actions will have. And so my only message tonight is hopefully a simple one, and that's I believe it's imperative for an American audience to not look away from the world and its problems. I believe it's imperative for an American audience to instead look at other people around the world and meet their gaze with compassion and curiosity. I think it's imperative for an American audience to not forget about places like Ukraine or the many other countries where American attention means so much. My hope is that the conversation you hear tonight is the first of many that you'll have with your friends and loved ones, and that our policymakers will ultimately have with each other. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for being a part of this event, for supporting this show, and I'd now like to play you a short clip from the podcast.
I get a phone call from a White House official. The first thing is I think to myself, oh shit.
Case officer with the Central Intelligence Agency.
And my first post was Embassy Kyiv.
My family was tortured, murdered, and robbed.
They said over and over and over again,
they know Russia better than we do.
And we just ignored it.
What if a warning siren sounds? Look for cover, the nearest cover.
I don't want to say Europe wasn't present, but it wasn't the hot issue.
And there was a time when the Ukrainian government had to decide.
We were all living in a bureaucratic process, and Putin's living in the world of hard power.
And the word escalation, everyone just says it. It's like a code word.
This latest escalation.
Paralyzed because of nuclear escalation fears.
Saw escalation potentially.
And you know what is interesting about the war? When you don't want to understand the war from the distance, it comes closer and closer.
From Lawfare and Goat Rodeo, this is Escalation, a podcast about the United States and Ukraine.
Moments ago announcing what he called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine and Russia will bring in troops into Ukraine.
Like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'd like to now introduce our panelists if you all want to get ready to join the stage. First, we have our moderator, Sasha Ingber, a national security journalist and the host of SpyCast, Spy Museum's flagship program. We have Anastasia Lapatina, a Ukrainian journalist who started covering Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the Kyiv Independent. Nastia is now a Ukraine fellow at Lawfare and one of the co-hosts of Escalation. We have Tyler McBrien. Tyler is the managing editor of Lawfare and a co-host of Escalation. He previously worked as an editor with the Council on Foreign Relations. And next we have Brigadier General Kipling Kaler, former senior defense official and defense attaché to Ukraine and Turkey. And finally, we have Emily Horn, a former National Security Council spokesperson and senior director for press, who helped execute the strategy to declassify and publicly share the details of the Russian invasion. Thank you all for making this happen. And Sasha, I'll throw it over to you.
All right, just double checking everybody can hear me okay. And thank you so much to Amanda and Max. You know, right now, while we are all sitting here, a barrage of Russian missiles are hitting Kyiv. Russia has made some slow, localized gains in the last few months. Ukraine has faced manpower issues, lags in artillery production, but they've also strengthened their domestic drone production. Now, we know that U.S. officials have been saying the clock is ticking on making a deal. Trump's peace proposal, according to the vice president today, includes recognizing the illegally seized Crimean Peninsula, a de facto recognition of 4 other occupied territories in Ukraine, and essentially barring Ukraine from joining NATO. Meanwhile, Ukraine's security guarantees remain vague. Zelensky has said that he will not give up Ukraine, quote, "There's nothing to talk about here. This is against our Constitution." And Trump writes on social media today, quote, "If he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago?" He also said it's inflammatory statements like Zelensky's that makes it so difficult to settle this war. Europe can't meet Ukraine's security needs fast enough, and this comes after an Easter Day ceasefire, which was proposed by Putin, which did not hold. Needless to say, it's a very grim situation. So starting us off, going down the line, responses on the news today to this proposed peace plan. I guess we'll start with you, Tyler.
Well, first, this is on? First, I want to thank the International Spy Museum. We were saying before that it has a certain cool factor, so I want to thank you for allowing me to brag to my friends that I could speak at the Spy Museum. But I mean, I think what I would want to talk about in that news is Trump's statements about who is the aggressor, about certain land belonging to Russia versus Ukraine as one of the motivating factors for us making the show. Is to cut through the noise, to set the record straight about Ukraine, which has become a political football, unfortunately, in the United States, a political football that has reverberations not just in Ukraine and Russia, but around the world. And so it's this warped and inverted misinformation about Ukraine that I think keeps coming up and has been sort of the guiding mission behind the show.
Nastia.
I have so many thoughts as a Ukrainian. I could speak just about my reactions to the news for 2 hours, but I just wanted to say that whenever Americans or people outside of Ukraine read about the news, they think about the politics of it, about the consequences for international law and things like that, which are all extremely important. But when I think about my reactions, I think about the fact that my husband is a Crimean Tatar from Crimea. So when I'm reading the headlines, I'm thinking about the land where part of my family still lives under Russian occupation, and what that means for them, and what that means for our children. And it's just really hard. Well, that's an understatement. It's excruciating to keep hearing this and reading this. And the word I keep using over and over since Trump's come back to the White House is just absurdity. Like almost everything he's ever said about Ukraine are lies and completely wrong and Russian propaganda straight out of Russian TV. And it's really scary. It's just an extremely scary moment in time. So.
And Kip.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It is a very complicated situation. This adds another level of complexity to it. President Zelensky has always stated that Crimea is part of Ukraine and it is an occupied territory and it needs to be returned. So it is absolutely natural to expect that when that is put onto the table as a negotiating thing, that the response from President Zelensky would be exactly what it was. So I don't think there's any surprises there. In regards to negotiations and dealing with this and trying to move everything to a peace negotiation, this is going to be extremely difficult. 3 years of war, it has been terrible. Plus, let's look at Crimea, it's 2014. There are a lot of emotions here, and nobody is going to win with how this ends, and it's going to be very, very difficult. So we're in that process of the negotiations. There's going to be a lot of bipolarity in regards to this or this. It's not going to be all or none. There's going to be a lot of gray area, and we're starting that process now, and that puts it into a big, like I said, a lot of complexity. And again, the emotions have to be appreciated on all sides, and especially on Ukraine's, because it is their blood and treasure.
And we have yet to see whether U.S. officials will continue to engage in peace negotiations. The pressure's on Zelensky now. Emily.
I'll echo my co-panelists. Thanks to the International Spy Museum for having us here. It's really wonderful to be with you all, and a special congratulations to Tyler and to Nastya for just a really outstanding podcast that for everyone here, if you've not had the chance to listen, I very strongly commend it to you all. I learned a lot from it, certainly. Yeah, the news today is heartbreaking for the people of Ukraine. I think it's heartbreaking for so many people around the world who have stood with Ukraine, who understand the stakes not just for the Ukrainian people, but the free rein that a deal like this would give to Putin as he thinks about his plans for the rest of the post-Soviet world and for Europe more broadly. It's very clear what Russia gets out of this peace deal. It's not very clear what benefits there are to the people of Ukraine, but as the dust continues to settle from the talks today, and we rightfully are very focused on the immediate impacts that if this deal were to move forward, what impact it would have on the people of Ukraine, I don't think we can neglect the broader geopolitical angle. We don't have a great track record of appeasing dictators and strong men working out well for folks in this part of the world more broadly. So again, I have a lot of opinions, but perhaps I'll stop there so we don't dominate the whole conversation with that.
Oh, I appreciate each of you coming at it with your own perspectives. So I want to go back to you, Emily, for a second here. Biden had been through this before in 2014 when Russia first invaded. Take us back to the White House in 2022, what it was like to declassify intelligence to show that Russia was planning to invade and that it was going to be much bigger this time.
Sure. So the quick version of this, because again, we could talk about this easily the whole time. The quick version of this was that we actually had a bit of a trial run, if folks will remember, in the spring of 2021, when the Russians went up to Ukraine's borders, halted their movements, and that led to, among other things, that helped lead to the conversation that President Biden and Putin had in Geneva in the summer of 2021. And coming back from that trip, having had some very frank and direct talks directly with Russian leadership about their intentions toward Ukraine, I think the feeling on the plane back home was this is not over. I don't think any of us would have predicted that a direct invasion of Ukraine was imminent in the next 6 months, but definitely there was the feeling that no one had said their final piece on this. And then, of course, in the summer of 2021, Putin came out with his manifesto, I guess we would call it, that made, from his perspective, the historical case that Ukraine is a part of Russia, that inherently Russia has the right to occupy and govern Ukraine as it sees fit. Lots of other things in there if you choose to spend your time reading that particular document, but that, for our purposes of this conversation, is the germane point. And very quickly, of course, we started to see in the intelligence the warning signs that echoed what we had started to see in the intel in 2014 that indicated an invasion was imminent. But there are a couple of things that really changed the information environment. One was that we had the historical precedent to learn from, and nobody wanted to be the person who was saying after the fact, well, we knew this was coming, but we couldn't say it, when obviously we had the responsibility to do something with what we were seeing. There's also the fact that the information environment and the technology environment had changed dramatically between 2014 and 2021, 2022. And so you're able to, when you're in a job like mine of trying to talk to reporters about what it was we were seeing without talking about sources and methods, I did not need to have necessarily a declassified map or declassified satellite imagery to show to a reporter to say, hey, this is happening and here's what we think it means. I could say, go look at this think tank that wrote their own report based on commercial satellite imagery and are staffed by former intelligence analysts who know how to do these kinds of assessments. They'll tell you exactly the same thing that I'm telling you, that based on publicly available open source information, we can all see this is what is happening, and this is what we think it means. And then finally, we also knew that the Russians were going to try to manipulate the information environment to create a pretext for an invasion, the same as they did in Crimea, that there would be plans for false flag operations, that there would be a pretext of some kind that they would put out there to say this is a legitimate peacekeeping operation or some protection of Russian nationals in the East. We had the opportunity to pre-butt that argument and to do so in part by exposing their plotting and their planning. Some of this, and we can talk about this in greater detail if folks desire, some of this was very tactical. We were able to say we found details of this particular operation that they're thinking about doing, this particular false flag. But again, there's historical precedent here. This is not all happening for the first time. We can say they're going to run the same kind of plays like they did in 2014. There will be little green men just like they did in 2014. And you covered this there. You witnessed this before. We know how this playbook is going to be executed.
So, Kip, you were abroad as this is underway. What was it like getting other countries on board with the U.S. intelligence, especially after the United States went into Iraq based on false intelligence?
It was a very interesting time because, as Emily was talking about, the intelligence was there. And we're watching this happen. And again, we have indicators and warnings, and we're just watching this. And so when Putin comes out and says, oh, this, and this, that was already scripted. When he says this, that means this goes from red to green. And so as he's starting to do this, the evidence is already going because there's only so many ways to skin a cat, if you will, in regards to this. And for them to do an invasion on Ukraine, there are certain things that have to happen. And we're starting to see these things. And so, of course, the call goes out. It's like, okay, we need to make sure that we have our coalition together, that we're starting this process now of getting allies and partners for Ukraine, because it's going to take that. Because the Russians are doing a very sophisticated denial and deception and indication operations. And of course, they're also messaging to other countries. So I was in Turkey at the time, and Turkey is very critical to Ukrainian security in regards to the Black Sea, the Bosphorus. And there's a Montrose Treaty that allows international passage of lines to there. And so having the Turks on board is very important. But the Turks are very skeptical of a lot of things. They're regional powers in the area, and they have their own intelligence sources. And so the Russians are also influencing those as well. So you can kind of see this is triple layer chess that we were trying to play here. And so we made sure we worked well with our Ukrainian partners. to understand and ask, whatever questions that they had as far as while they were in Turkey. Also, we had to deal with the Turkish intelligence apparatus as well. So you have the Turkish intelligence service, and then you had their J2 or their military intelligence service. And our job was to take what Emily had declassified and brief it to them and say, this is what we've got. What are your questions?
Yeah, but how did they respond?
Initially, they were skeptical because, again, they have a border with Iraq. And so, and they were players in 2003 as well. And there were players in 1990. So this is their area, and it had a lot they had a lot of skin in the game. And so they initially were skeptical, but as we briefed, this is what's happening and this is what we think is going to happen next. And then these things actually happened. They started to becoming less skeptical and much more of a partner and helping us to understand what they're seeing. And that was not just with the Turks, but every other attaché in that country was also, we were available to answer their questions and talk. And then they would go back to their country. And this is also going on in their country too. So they're always comparing the notes. What is the United States saying? And is there any daylight? And how confident are the Americans in their sources and methods that this is going on? And this is also going on with our Five Eyes partners and everybody else who are also skeptical in certain areas, but we're also coming on board. The question is when were they going to come on board? And was it going to be long enough ahead of the Russian invasion where we could actually have some decision advantage for policymakers, both in Ukraine and in other capitals around the world?
So I'm skipping in time right now, but Nastya, the U.S. intelligence community assessed that Putin was betting that Western support for Ukraine would diminish over time. And we have seen that play out, at least here in Washington. What's your take?
I think the answer to why Russia thought that ultimately they could exhaust the West and exhaust the U.S. when it comes to Ukraine is part of it, I think, is because Russia cares more about Ukraine than the U.S. do. And this is something we address in the podcast a little bit in one of our episodes, that if you look in history, Ukraine was never the top concern for the U.S., and very often it wasn't even in the top 5 or 10. Meanwhile, for Russia, very often Ukraine was, this imperial obsession for hundreds of years. And so there is definitely an asymmetry of interests that plays here. Another thing is something that Fiona Hill mentioned in the trailer, and I love that quote, where she says that we were living in a bureaucratic process with the U.S., and Putin is living in the world of hard power. And I think that also is the answer to why Russia was right that the U.S. would ultimately just get tired of the war, because Russia is extremely, extremely good at weaponizing and using the democratic processes and the bureaucracy and the institutions abroad. It's very good at finding loopholes and poking into them. It's very good at, for example, the conversation Tyler and I had the other day about free speech laws in the US and how all of the Russian influence operations love the fact that, there are laws in the US that prohibit you from banning, certain outlets and certain sources. Russia's gonna find those loopholes and poke into them. And so I'm sure that Russia knew that when they invade, the White House is gonna go in its cycle of deliberations, and it's gonna take a year to, go through all of the checks and discussions and conversations about weapons deliveries, about escalation management. They could expect all of this from, the institutions in the U.S., and they knew that they could use that to their advantage. So I think that's why, and I think unfortunately they were right in assessing that the U.S. would ultimately get tired. We're seeing that every day now.
Could I just add one thing to that? I think to pick up on the beginning of what you were talking about, a good example of that is even if you look at the beginning of the Biden administration when U.S. support for Ukraine was at its highest, one of the main appeals that was made was Russia won't stop at Ukraine, it will continue. But implicit in that appeal even is the message that Ukraine in and of itself is not worth fighting for. It's not enough to to merit this kind of support. So I think even from the beginning, even when U.S. support was at its highest, it was still limited. It was still undercut by this idea that Ukraine is not enough.
Speaking of asymmetry, Tyler, we know that Obama would not provide Ukraine with lethal aid. Trump sold Ukraine javelins, and Biden provided heavy weapons, but that took a while. There were restrictions on striking Russia. Why has the U.S. response consistently been less than what Ukraine has wanted?
It's a great question, and that underpins the entire show. And it's a question I think that may surprise a lot of Americans. I was surprised to learn, at least when we started making this show, that public enemy number one for a time in Ukraine was Jake Sullivan, because there was an impression that the U.S. wasn't giving enough to Ukraine. But I think there are a few factors at play here. First,
seeing some eyebrows raised on the other side of this panel.
I didn't say he's not my public enemy. He's the impression that I was getting from my Ukrainian colleagues. I think there's a few things at play here. First is something that a Ukrainian diplomat told us in the making of the show, Boris Tarasyuk. He said that America always looks at Ukraine through Russian glasses or Russian lenses. That is to say, we sort of address Ukraine on Russian terms often, and that's because the name of the show is Escalation. A lot of what the U.S. response is, it's filtered through this fear of escalating things with Russia, or it's filtered through a false hope that better days are ahead with U.S.-Russian relations, despite this continued, despite events happening to the contrary that should teach Americans to know better, I think, at least in the telling of our show. So I think it goes back to what I said to the last answer. The reason why the U.S. will never give Ukraine fully what they want is because the U.S. ultimately isn't concerned about Ukraine as much as it is about Russia.
And possibly the United States itself. Speaking of escalation, Emily, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Biden. He very much feared that the war would escalate, that the war would spread. And Putin ultimately played into that with his nuclear saber rattling. The U.S. ultimately crossed some of Russia's purported red lines, providing long-range missiles, allowing Ukraine to strike first near Kharkiv, then, after Trump won the election in November, allowing Ukraine to strike deep into Russia with U.S. weapons. Do you think the Biden administration should have been so cautious in those early years?
So as the saber rattling in advance of the Russian invasion was beginning, President Biden laid out 3 objectives for what this war needed to be from the U.S. perspective, which were, 1, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which was absolutely sacrosanct every day of the Biden administration. And it's one of the reasons why seeing Ukraine essentially be cut out of any peace, and I use that term very loosely, negotiations right now is so upsetting. The second was, do not allow this to become a wedge between NATO allies and defend every square inch of NATO territory. And the third was, don't get sucked into World War III. Those were the stakes that existed not just for the United States and Russia, but truly for the world. And those were the questions that we had to confront in a very real way in the early days of the invasion, when it was not at all clear, given Putin's risk assessment and calculation from his own perspective, that nuclear weapons use was going to be off the table. That was not at all clear. I think it took us some time to understand that that was not something that was going to be a tool in his particular toolkit, but that was not clear in the early weeks and months. And I think we have to be very honest about those stakes and the lack of perfect information that you have as a policymaker when you're confronting those kinds of really complex and just truly existential stakes as you're thinking about what these things look like in practice. It's very easy, with the benefit of hindsight, I think, to look back and say, could certain things have been sped up? Absolutely. I don't think there's any question on that. What I would add to that is the both the domestic political constraints that you're always operating under in the United States. I was reminded, going back and rereading some news clips from 2022 and 2023 in this, remember how in 2023, when congressional Republicans decided to tie existential military assistance to Ukraine to the immigration debate? Those two things were linked together by congressional Republicans. And then candidate Trump went ahead and killed the immigration bill for laughs just a few months later. So that's the kind of dynamic that you're dealing with in the Biden administration when you're trying to figure out how to marshal the kind of political and public support to get Ukraine what it needs, is you have all of these unnecessary things that have nothing to do with Ukraine's existential fight for survival against Russia and its ability to defend itself being larded up in this policy process. There is also, I think critics will say this is bureaucracy. I would argue that this is the reality of having a defense industrial base in a superpower state. There is the reality of our own supply stocks and the need to refill and modernize our own defense systems. There's a great speech that Jake gave at CSIS in the final weeks of the Trump administration, the Biden administration, where he talks about this. But we realized pretty early on in 2022, as this conflict was beginning, that we were burning through our own ammunition stocks at a really alarming pace, and that we had to do a massive amount of domestic investment in order to replenish our own javelins, our own ammunition supplies, that we had to get really creative with how we worked with NATO allies and others to make sure that we were getting Ukraine what it needed quickly if it did not come from our own supply stocks, but also that we were thinking long-term about how to help the Ukrainian defense industrial base modernize, get cheap stuff off the shelves really quickly. This is a conflict where the drones that are being made are arguably just as, if not more impactful than some of the larger military systems. And so you can't just do the deliveries of the one really complex long-range system. You've also got to do the little things that, in fact, have a huge impact in the battle space.
Kip, as Emily had mentioned, Biden would repeatedly say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. He would often say, as long as it takes. But it turns out that expires when Biden is no longer in the White House. Given your background, does Trump's recent pause in intelligence sharing affect the Kyiv-Washington relationship moving forward, and how?
So the pause, there's the intelligence that is provided is going to run a huge sphere of different types of products.
Right. Well,
And-
just to clarify, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said defensive intelligence continued. So I guess we're
Yes.
talking more about the targeting side.
Yeah, you're going to be talking about things that could be considered more offensive in nature. So there is always going to be a second and third order effects in regards to that, because intelligence is absolutely critical. And is one of the better things that we can provide to Ukraine. It provides them decision advantage on how to best use the limited resources that they have. Also, to find out and to help them defend from the drone targeting, and as Emily mentioned, trying to get the defense industrial base protected that the Ukrainians have. Because again, if you make a factory out there, it's stagnant or it's stationary, and the Russians can hit it, and then all that donor support that went into that gets blown up, and that starts to move into some type of donor fatigue, which is what we're trying to avoid. But there is going to be some secondary and third order effects that are going to happen from an intelligence pause. It didn't last for very long, and that happened after I was already gone from Ukraine. But again, it's not just our intelligence. It's you get intelligence from Europe. You get intelligence from everybody who is working on behalf of Ukraine's interests.
Right. The Ukrainians turned to MI6 after the U.S. paused the military aid and intelligence. But I'm still trying to understand, what are those secondary and tertiary effects?
Well, again, it's going to make your ability to defend or ability to attack, it's going to degrade that. And also, when you're talking about, okay, what type of effects did a long-range strike have? So that you can figure out whether you want to attack it again or whether it was destroyed and you had the effects that you wanted.
but in the sense of the relationship between the intelligence services.
Intelligence services are used to having their relationships strained by political issues. It's just a fact of life. And that is something that intelligence professionals understand and appreciate. And this is why you have to have good rapport with your liaison partners that can withstand this type of challenge.
Oh, I hope someone in the audience asks about how you build that rapport. So this is for Nastia and Tyler. Trump, he initially vowed to end the war in 24 hours. Then he upped it to 100 days. Now, we all know he was pressing for this minerals deal. Russia was exempted from tariffs. The White House saying there was no meaningful trade between the U.S. and Russia because of the sanctions the U.S. imposed after 2014. Now the U.S. is proposing the recognition of the Crimean Peninsula. And of course, as we know from our earlier conversation, barring Ukraine from joining NATO. Does this hurt the U.S.-Ukraine relationship? And should Ukraine pivot more toward Europe?
Yes and yes. But
can you be a little clearer?
I'll be a bit more elaborate. So, I mean, it absolutely hurts the relationship in the deepest way possible. And, you know, I sort of came of age and understood what my political identity is right after the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. So that was 2014. And that was the moment when the Ukrainian society really cemented its westward leaning and, you know, this political orientation to the West, right? We enshrined in our constitution then that we wanted to join the European Union, we wanted to join NATO, and Russia was a terrible imperialistic neighbor, and we wanted to be like the US, closer to the US. And so this is what my generation grew up knowing. I grew up looking up to America in every way possible, and I was always politically minded, and I always knew that we should be building our country to be like the US, to have these institutions, to have this democracy, to have these bureaucratic processes that are great in peacetime. And it's just so heartbreaking to see that image that my generation had of the United States just completely collapse. And it's just really hard to wrap your head around it. And I was having some interviews in the wake of the destruction of USAID with some young Ukrainians who work in the NGO sphere. And I was talking to them about what they think is going to happen with the cut in aid. And some of them were so hopeful, and they would tell me, like, yes, there are these complicated political trends happening in Trump and everything, but it's America. They have laws, they have courts. It's all gonna straighten itself out because that's how it works. And I just couldn't help but think that, like, I don't think it does anymore. And, like, that's just no longer a reality. At least that's how it feels to me. My Lawfare colleagues know better. But yeah, it's just extremely sad to see how Ukraine used to be one of the most pro-American countries in the world. Like we used to joke that, you know, we're probably the only country in the world that wants American imperialism. Like we want American officials to come and get rid of corruption and teach us how to build institutions and do all of this. Like, we welcome you, we want you here, we want your help. And now we're like, you know, that's kind of awkward now because you guys don't have your shit together, so you can't tell us that we're corrupt anymore, really. So it's really heartbreaking, and yeah.
And Tyler, as you add on to this question, I'm also wondering if the rift ultimately could serve to make Ukraine less dependent on the United States and perhaps someday stronger against Russian imperialism.
Yeah, I think when thinking about the Trump administration, at least for myself, I'm always trying to sort through what's continuity and what's a total break with the past. And in Ukraine policy, I think you do have a mix of both. So I think there is some continuity in the U.S., in this case, Trump putting what he sees as his interests ahead of that of Ukraine. But in many ways, it's just a complete acceleration of the worst impulses of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. And to answer the second part of your question, I think Ukraine is already is right to already be pivoting toward Europe and to seek support elsewhere, because we're seeing the fate of an uncertain ally who's sort of suspended in this ambiguity where the United States will commit something verbally but not follow through, or signal something and then switch back the other way. And if you're on the receiving end of that, or if you're dependent on that, it's an existential risk that you just can't afford to take.
Kip, one thing that the podcast did was talk about how the U.S. at times had prioritized relations with Russia over relations with Ukraine. And I'm wondering to what extent you believe the United States is turning attention right now toward the Indo-Pacific to counter China, and possibly using Russia to drive a wedge between the relationship, the so-called unlimited relationship between Moscow and Beijing.
There is a distinct possibility that that is exactly what's happening. Again, the United States is a global power. And as Emily mentioned, we've got global requirements. We have operational plans that require certain levels of munitions. Our intelligence resources are not unlimited. They have to be managed as well. Europe needs to, and as Tyler had mentioned this thing, and this is also that's important, is that Europe needs to take a larger leadership role in Ukraine in regards to dealing with Russia in Ukraine from a NATO standard, from an EU standard, and from a geographical standard. They are the people who are closer there. Also the fact that we have to build those alliances in regards to the Indo-PACOM pivot, which of course President Obama started, and which we are continuing to move forward through there. As Emily had also mentioned, our lack of stores, every one of these weapon systems that are not being replaced, because we've stopped the production lines on many of those and have not started them again, or to start them requires a lot more outlay of funds. We have to maintain a capability for any type of Indo-PACOM contingency operation. And it's not just Indo-PACOM. If we look at what's going on in the Red Sea in regard to the Houthis, a lot of our European partners were not capable of maintaining the weapons expenditures in order to keep the Houthis at bay, because those ships go through from the Red Sea are not coming to the United States. They're going to Europe. So this has a lot to do with the European economy as well. And we're pivoting and making sure that that area is, that we're trying to bring order out of that chaos down there, and to keep the Houthis in the box in that area. So of course we've got all these different pulls for resources, and we can't be strong everywhere. We have to pick and choose, and we have to let the Europeans, and the Europeans have taken over the Ramstein meetings, the UDCG, and the Europeans have done that, and they've done very well on that part. But again, the Europeans they're running into this. This is more of a confederation with NATO, not necessarily a good decision-making body in regards to quick decisions. Thorough decisions, just fully discussed decisions, but Ukraine needs stuff now. They need action now. They need weapon systems now. And unfortunately, Europe does not have those weapon systems anymore. After the second year, Europe was at the bottom of the barrel. And that was after 32 years of being in a peace dividend. They didn't feel it was necessary to do that. And now they have to. But it takes time to build these facilities and this capability, and to make sure that they can handle, that Ukraine gets what it needs to. But again, at the United States, we have Japan, we have South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, India, all these other countries that are trying to figure out, well, what about China? What about Indo-PACOM threat? And also, you've got Iran and other countries in there with what's going on in the Middle East. So nothing got simpler. Everything got much more complicated. And so we're having like, okay, what can we let the Europeans have, and what do we need to focus on right now? And I think that this is what we're seeing, and there's some, there's some concerns about this and how this is going to shake out from every other country's concerns and national concerns and national worries.
And I just want to go down the line with a quick 30-second, 1-minute answer on this question. As you'd mentioned, NATO. What is the future of NATO, starting with you, Emily? Your thoughts as the United States starts to pull back?
As an avowed transatlanticist, I profoundly hope that it still exists in 3 3/4 years. Is that a short enough answer for you?
Yeah. Kip.
NATO is going to continue. It's going to undergo some changes. The original reasons for NATO are still there, but NATO is bigger. I mean, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, NATO was playing a part in that as well. So NATO is no longer just a European entity. It's expanding its look as far as, okay, well, how does NATO support our allies and partners in whatever they're doing? NATO is also in a rebuilding phase. NATO lapsed over 30 years. It got tired. It got bureaucratic. It was more of a debating society and less of a war-fighting institution. It's getting back to its war-fighting institution. I was on the wall the night that it fell, back in 1989 and 1990, and I can tell you that NATO today is different than the NATO that was back then. But I'm seeing the change going back to it. The discussions, the desire for a more robust, expeditionary, capable force that is focused on land warfare and securing our European countries that are members of NATO and other folks who are democracies and deserve to be protected.
A much more rosy take than Emily. Nastia, what are you going to say?
I'm much more with Emily than with Kip, but I'm curious, I guess, in sort of a negative sense, about what's going to happen in the next however many years or a decade in places like Estonia or Lithuania and Latvia, Finland, all of the places that no longer feel safe, that are actively preparing for what some of these intelligence services are saying a looming threat from Russia towards NATO. And I often think about this, like who's gonna, if Russia decides to do a minor incursion into Estonia or, do a land bridge from Kaliningrad to Belarus, which is essentially Russian territory by now, who's gonna go to war over, I don't know, a few dozen villages on the border? Who's gonna fight? What is gonna be NATO's response now that we've seen such a cautious approach with Ukraine, which of course is not a NATO member? It's different, but still, I'm just really curious what that could look like, and I of course hope that never happens and we never have to see what that test looks like. But it's really interesting to see these countries prepare and kind of finding themselves in a new reality now.
And there is a wealth of analysis that Russia is trying to test NATO. Tyler.
I think I'm also close to Nastia on this one. I think as much as the European members of NATO would like to continue to count on the U.S. as a reliable and good member of NATO, I don't think they're holding their breath, and I think they are. I think we'll see a continuation of a trend that's already happening. Call it a Nordicization of the rest of Europe, but an emphasis on resilience, an emphasis on this whole of society approach to prepare for war. It's almost a pre-war footing. We're seeing remilitarization. We're seeing more expenditures in defense budgets. We're seeing in Germany, they're developing an app to tell people where bunkers are in the case of bombings. I mean, I think when in 2018, when Sweden mailed its emergency pamphlet out to every household, it may have seemed like alarmism to some in Western Europe, but now it just seems like pragmatism. And I think France, Germany, other countries in Western Europe are sort of catching up to the Nordic countries who have been on this pre-war, emergency resilience footing for a number of years.
We really have a spectrum of opinions on this stage. Now, I want to go back to you, Emily, and talk about the United States. Russia's influence campaign here has included false information that Ukraine and Zelensky are corrupt. That's just one example. But what are your thoughts on why some Americans, including U.S. government officials, have adopted a similar perspective?
Oh boy. Well, look, this is what we're seeing now is the result of a decade plus of a very sophisticated, as Kip said, very deeply resourced and very powerful disinformation operation that has been targeting the United States, but not just the United States. And concerningly, in the last 8 years, it's become not just a Russia-directed operation, but truly a global operation that has alliances of convenience with state-run media in China, in Iran, even in North Korea. The objective of all of this is to destabilize the United States so that it cannot be a corrective on the expansionist goals of various autocrats and dictators around the world. By dividing us at home, these powers believe they can check our international influence, diminish our credibility and as a partner, and destabilize the world in their favor. Unfortunately, that has found purchase with some politicians in the United States who are willing to overlook the long game that our adversaries are playing for their own individual short-term benefits, whether it is a convenient excuse for why their ideas are not more popular, whether it is a validation of their worst impulses. Importantly, whether it enriches them personally, which is a huge part of the playbook, whether it is through overt payments to appear on Russian state media, whether it is through funding your media operation, funding your institute, funding your personal family office or the businesses of your family, buying your cryptocurrency and enriching your family. This is a multi-pronged operation that is designed to get into not just the minds and the talking points, but the pocketbooks of a number of American politicians, most of whom should know better, many of whom have chosen whatever their own individual short-term interest is. It's been very sophisticated, it's been very effectively done, and it's been really distressing to see. A lot of Americans who should know a lot better refuse to see what is right in front of them.
Could I just jump in for a sec? The fact that Zelensky individually and Ukraine in general as a country have a corruption problem, a very deep one and a very problematic one, that's not a secret, and the Ukrainian citizens will always be the first ones to point it out, and we are always the first ones directly suffering from it. But you can't really use that as a reason to stop helping Ukraine and instead do business with Russia, which is way more corrupt and a dictatorship. So it's just quite hypocritical of some of those Republicans to bring it up, given everything that's happening in the White House right now. But it's not to say that it's that Ukraine's corruption problem is a product of Russian disinformation. It's not. We do have a problem and we acknowledge it, and we will always be the first ones to talk about it.
I think that Russian disinformation often grows from a kernel of truth. And understanding the separation, the breakdown between people who truly believe the Russian argument versus those who are profiting from it, who see it for political expedience. What is that breakdown? I'd be interested to know if a poll could be done. But speaking of misconceptions, Tyler, I wanted to ask you about this, and Kip, you might have something to chime in here too, but the U.S.-Ukraine intelligence services got a lot closer by the time the full-scale invasion started. Now, we know that the United States did a great job of declassifying the intelligence that Russia was planning this invasion, false flag operations, all of it. But the U.S. also wrongly assessed that Ukraine's ability to defend itself would be weak, that Kyiv would fall in a matter of days. Are you concerned about other misconceptions and how that could also ultimately affect U.S. support for the country?
I mean, yeah, every episode of Escalation is about a different misconception, a different misalignment of priorities. So this has plagued the relationship since its inception. But again, I think I go back to what I was saying at the beginning, that this is an acceleration of that trend. I think that absolutely hamstrung U.S. support at the beginning. Had the United States better assessed Ukrainian resolve and ability to defend its homeland, perhaps the United States would have been open to giving more support or putting less limitations on the weapons it did provide. And I think that's again, going back to this relationship that the U.S. Views, doesn't give full-throated support to Ukraine that it would to other allies. And so I think that has always held back the relationship.
Kip?
So the relationship with Ukrainian services is one of those that it evolved after 2014, along with our military partnership with them, especially with the California National Guard, which is the state partnership for Ukraine. And Ukraine and Californian National Guardsmen worked together for almost 20 years, making sure that Ukraine was capable of taking the intelligence and working with that, along with our Special Operations Forces working with Ukrainian Special Operations Forces. However, what was going on, we were focusing more on the Donbass as far as that particular engagement versus a full-throated, massive invasion of the country to try to decapitate it. So the goal was to slow down the Russians, to make sure that they ran into problems, because again, when you're talking about a big, large operation, you're talking about communications, you're talking about logistics, you're talking about coordination, all those things. And as the Russians started to expand, the Ukrainians were contracting, but that allowed them to use forces in a more capable way. Another thing is the intelligence that we were able to provide them on Hostomel. And in a battle, you come down to one particular part, which is the decisive point. If they win it and you lose it, you lose. All right? But if you hold it and they don't, you have that opportunity to seize the initiative. So what happened was, we're telling them, you've got to protect Hostomel, which is an airport that is right outside of Kiev.
And we're talking 2022 at this
We're
point.
talking during the invasion. And so if you can hold it, the rest will start to come apart, because that was where the airborne troops were going to come in, and then they were going to spread out from there, and they were going to decapitate Kiev. They were going to take out the leadership, they were going to take out the command and control and everything else, and that ends the rest of the country. So that one decisive point, which is absolutely key. So we were able to get the intelligence to the Ukrainians were able to do it. They were able to get their territorial defense forces, their National Guard, their forces in there. And the Russians kept going after Hostomel Airport for weeks. They even were able to get combat troops from armored units in there, but they were not able to hold it because the Ukrainians focused on that. And that was where our intelligence and the Ukrainians' intelligence on the ground met to have synergy, which is 1 + 1 = 6. And that's what happened. And the Russians didn't have that. And so Hostomel was a key victory for the Ukrainians, and that was the victory that stopped the Russians, and that forced them to reevaluate and to pull back. And so we were there. We made sure that the Ukrainians had what they needed as far as the intelligence, and that's when we started bringing in. We knew that they had won Hostomel, so we could start the process to start reinforcing the logistics. You don't want to give them all these weapon systems and then the Russians just capture them. You want to make sure that they're going to the right place. And this is still something that we worked on for almost 2 years to make sure the Ukrainian system and our system was working together from an intelligence standpoint, but also from a logistics standpoint.
Stands in stark contrast to Afghanistan. Emily?
It's interesting that you mentioned Afghanistan. One of the things that I think was very difficult for the intelligence community to assess in the run-up to the Russian invasion was the role that leadership would play in the event of an invasion. It is so powerful, and it's very difficult to quantify, but I think we all know it when we see it. And I don't think that anyone could have predicted in January of 2022 the way that President Zelensky would, and to be clear, I mean this as a compliment, perform the role of the presidency, perform the role of leader, of defender of the Ukrainian people in the early days of the invasion. And contrast that to the Afghan leadership who fled the country and left their people behind to deal with the Taliban and ISIS and a whole host of other dangerous actors. But when you imagine those early days of the invasion, you probably have an image of your mind, and it probably is something to do with President Zelensky, doing a selfie video walking the deserted streets of Kyiv, or seeing a really beautifully produced video that features the Ukrainian people taking up arms, even though they're civilians, in defense of their country. I'm getting chills just thinking about some of these moments. They were extraordinarily well done by a very small group of people within the Ukrainian government, and I think it is to their immense credit, and I think to President Zelensky in particular, as a former actor who understands the power of performance and the power of the information space, the work that Ukrainian leadership was able to do to seize and control their own narrative in the immediate aftermath of the invasion had such a profound impact, I'm sure, on morale, on the ability for the Ukrainian people to be proud of their country, to stand up and fight for their country, but crucially, for the international community to see this is someone whose back we need to have. We need to not just impose the costs on Russia because it is objectively the right thing to do, and because it is in our own individual national interests, but because this guy has momentum. This country has momentum. This is a fight that can be won. And that momentum that they were able to build, I think, bought them, along with a lot of other very, very important things, a runway that really lasted for a very long time.
And I wanted to end this portion of the conversation with a question to Nastya. In the podcast, you talk about how the relationship between the United States and Ukraine is bittersweet, how Ukraine had hoped to join NATO. There was an ambiguous promise made in 2008. There was warning, there was a fear that Russia was going to disturb Ukraine's sovereignty. But whether we're talking about intelligence officers, diplomats, there were a lot of times when those messages, those warnings, ultimately fell on deaf ears. And there were people who expressed regret. They look back now and they wish that they had made different choices. So my question to you is, do you have hope that U.S. leaders, spies, diplomats, that they're going to learn one of the major lessons here, which is to listen to the overwhelming majority of Ukrainian voices, voices in the know, authoritative voices in the future?
I do, because I think that what's been happening in Ukraine since 2022, for some people, not all, but certainly for the ones who really understand what's going on and who care, it was probably a point of no return. It was this breaking point of understanding that at least as long as Putin is in power, and there's a question of what happens after that, and that future is also probably very worrying if you ask Ukrainians. As long as Russia exists in the form that it is right now, you just can't go to business as usual. And I know that not all American politicians believe in that. It seems like half of Washington is actively trying to go to business as usual with Russia right now. But I think for some people, what happened in Ukraine in 2022 really opened their eyes, because after you see what happened in Bucha, after you see tens and tens of thousands of murdered civilians in Mariupol, and when you see just cities raised off the map, how do you just go back to a time before that? As long as you have a heart and a clear mind, you really can't. There's no way. So I think Russia just showed its very true self here in this war, and I hope that people will remember that every time they make a decision about buying Russian gas, which still happens in many places in Europe in huge quantities much larger than what those countries have given Ukraine to defend itself. Every time people make a decision about Russia, I just want them to remember what happened in Ukraine and just wrestle with that. And so I hope for people it's going to be a clear guiding light in their policy decisions.
Thank you. And we're going to open it up to questions. We'd love your feedback, but let's just try to keep this to questions because we have all this expertise on the stage.
Go right ahead.
Great.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the panel. One of my questions I always had in 2022, the Russians obviously used Belarusian soil to help initiate the invasion. Why didn't the Belarusians get involved themselves with actual soldiers? Or maybe they did, and I just didn't read it in open source. However, or was there any other back channeling through the Biden administration or other European allies that told them, hey, we understand Russia's going to invade, but you better not get involved yourself?
I wasn't in Ukraine when they did that part. But the use of Russian space is something that it allowed them a flank that was able, and this is another reason. I mean, if you look at the logistics, it's going to come in from Poland. It has to go through a very long border of Belarus. The issue here is, are they going to continue to do fires out of there and try to interdict it, or are they going to, what are they going to do? And we're constantly watching. The Russians are like, oh, we're going to do a joint training thing with Belarus. Well, we're watching that all the time, and we're very concerned about it. There's a lot of messaging going on as well, and especially from our allies, from a country that sounds like the word Poland. But, they're right there on that border as well. And there's like, hey, look, escalation cuts both ways, all right? So you need to be very careful about getting that close to Europe and to NATO. So I think that's probably why you're not seeing the Belarusians get involved to the degree that Russia would like them to. I am sure Russia wants them to, but they're limited in what they can do as well. And now, as far as providing weapon systems and everything else but people, Belarus is definitely involved in all that. So
it always seemed to me like Lukashenko kind of owed Putin after the protests. Russia came in and made sure that Lukashenko.
Yeah, Belarus is not some solid power. He is in trouble, and so Lukashenko had to do the neighborly thing, but that's all. And I think that he's very, very careful now.
Okay, we have a big line of people, so let's move along.
Forget about our online audience.
Oh, great. Well, I'll try and be quick then. I was just really appreciate this. I'd be curious. Let's assume that peace deal signed today. I think there's still no trust between Ukraine, or frankly, I spent a lot of time in Estonia and much of the Baltics between them and Russia, and they think that maybe there will be a 3 to 5 year break for Russia to kind of rebuild its troops and munitions. I'd be curious, what do you think happens with U.S.-EU relations and with EU relations writ large? I mean, do we finally get Macron's vision of a more sovereign Europe and more defense production there, and for a full disentangling of kind of U.S. and EU commitments? And if not, what would it actually take for the EU to break away from the U.S.? Thanks.
Have fun, you guys.
It's a great question. If I knew the answer, I'd be doing a lot of things differently. Look, the way that you frame this is really interesting. If this does not inspire Europe to take its capacity for greater defense production, for greater willingness to do the kind of military buildups that I think both sides of the aisle have encouraged Europe to undertake, then what would? I think that's the question that they're grappling with right now. I think it's also important that the Europe-U.S. relationship not be looked at solely through the defense and security lens. Europe is still our largest trading partner, and so we have to have a conversation about tariffs, for example, if we're talking about the future of the U.S.-EU relationship. We have to have a conversation about immigration. It's a very complex and set of dynamics that a lot of European leaders are grappling with. I suspect the way that this administration is going to try to play it is that you're going to see a desire to engage with countries one-on-one rather than with the EU as a bloc. I think they've been pretty clear about that. And so it's going to be up to individual leaders to as Meloni did when she was here last week, to carry water on behalf of their neighbors to the Trump administration. To what degree their own domestic politics constrain or empower them to do so is going to be a really interesting thing to be watching, because of course the MAGA phenomenon has gone global, and so each one of them is dealing with a right-wing populist flank at home that they're going to have to factor into how they approach the Trump administration.
I'll also add just really quickly, the part of your question about whatever the future of the Baltic countries' relationship is with Europe, to say nothing of Ukraine's relationship, with Russia, in a post-Putin world, in a post-peace deal world. I think that was some of the hardest and honestly bleakest conversations that I had with Nastya about what like a post-conflict reconciliation process would even look like.
Don't even say that word to me, please.
Right, there you go. So that's I think some of where I've been most dour, honestly.
All right, just want to make sure we get one in. We have so many. This person is asking if any of you would address the Iran, Russia, Israel saga as it relates to Ukraine.
Sure. To many Ukrainians, the relationship between U.S. and Israel is, I'll be blunt, kind of an annoying one, because we see what happens when Israel is under threat, and we see the American response. And it just feels so drastically different to how the U.S. has been approaching Ukraine and approaching that relationship. And yeah, I remember in the aftermath of that big Iranian attack, all Ukrainians were talking about this and being like, hey, so you guys can actually get your systems on the ground and get your planes in the air and get directly involved and not worry about escalation management. And the civilian response was really, really emotional about that, because it seemed like kind of a bit of a hypocritical betrayal on the part of the American side.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for a really, really interesting and illuminating conversation. It's been great. My question kind of revolves around what Ukraine still needs from the American people. I think there's still, there's been a change of leadership, as you guys have been noting, but I think there's a lot of people in, the United States who still care very deeply about this issue. And my question is, what is it that Ukraine needs from the American people? Maybe this is most directly for Nastya, but what can we do to put our shoulder to the wheel, so to speak, to help?
The best thing you can do is donate to the Ukrainian army. That's going to have the biggest, most direct impact. Go to Come Back Alive. It's one of the most trusted foundations we have that buys weapons for the Ukrainian army. And, donate your $5 here and there to them, and it's going to make a huge difference. And just talk to your friends, to your neighbors, get confrontational with Trump supporters, and try to dispel some of the Russian myths, because the Russians throw so much money and effort into making sure that the way the world sees Ukraine is very far from reality. And they have thousands of people whose job it is to spread lies about Ukraine online. So as much as you can, try to counteract that in your regular life. But first of all, and most importantly, donate to the Ukrainian army, because the Ukrainian army is really the only force here that can actually stop the war and defeat Russia.
Hi, here my question. I'm concerned about Ukraine because I'm Ukrainian, and most of my region is under occupation. But I personally think that Ukraine is able to hold more than 3 years, and after this could be new administration. And what do you think about this weakness, to my point of view, if, for example, new administration will come after current administration and revert back, making NATO stronger again, or maybe helping Ukraine more rapidly. So what do you think about this weakness of change in administration and how opposite their approaches could be?
I think first, thank you for your question, and my thoughts are with your family and with your community for everything that you have endured under occupation, and I'm glad that you're here and safe. I think that Putin views U.S. democracy and the fact that we change administrations regularly, the fact that we have this robust, often very messy democratic process as a weakness. He views his ability to retain office and exercise power indefinitely and put down his opposition as a source of his strength. And he views our democracy as fundamentally flawed and unable to match that power because it, from his perspective, does not endure the way that a dictatorship or an autocracy can endure. My fervent hope is that our ability to correct our mistakes, to learn from them, is in fact one of our greatest sources of strength. And I hope so much, and I still believe, that when, not if, there is a free and fair election, that we're going to come to a very different result that is going to center not just our domestic issues, but we'll talk about what it means for America to lead in the world again and not just retreat inward and tear ourselves apart internally over the things that we disagree on, but what we can do when we project a vision outward to the world. And that a huge part of that vision is our capacity to correct our mistakes and to adjust a course of action. So I remain an optimist that when we come back, when not if, to lead in the world again, that we will be able to do so. It will be an uphill fight, no question. The year and change that I spent with the Biden administration, we went around the world and all we heard from interlocutors in that first 4 years was, okay, you're back, but what happens when you leave again? And those questions are going to be much sharper and much more pointed, and they absolutely should be. We have, I think, a lot of work to do at home. We've touched on some of that in this discussion. But we have the capacity to do that if we choose to do that. And that is, again, I think, a real source of strength. Autocracies and dictatorships do not have that capacity for self-correction. And I remain hopeful that we will avail ourselves of that opportunity when it's time in free and fair elections.
Thank
you. I'm shorter than most people here. My question, I have two quick questions. One question is, do you think that in the Oval Office with the meeting with Zelensky, was that a genuine, unscripted interaction, or was it intentional? Because in my interpretation, if you really listen to what Zelensky was trying to express in a language that is not his native language, he was trying to say, what good is it signing a peace treaty if it will not be honored, hence what happened during Easter. And my other second question is, do you think that we're living in a time where it's a culminating point for example, the Koch brothers and their affiliates, that we're living in a time of what they've been working on since the Reagan administration, and that comes from Dark Money by Jane Mayer, after I've been reading a few chapters from that book.
Don't just, I'll jump right on it.
I've heard many people say that what happened in the Oval Office was scripted. I've also heard some people say that Zelensky provoked that whole thing. I think that what mattered in that meeting was like the way that Trump spoke and Zelensky spoke, that was all kind of beside the point. And the most important part was that the US is no longer on our side, that the US is now openly aligning itself with Russia. And I think that became just completely clear, and that kind of crystallized for me personally in that meeting. And so you could debate whether it was a stunt by J.D. Vance or whoever, but I think you just have to grapple with the fact that, like, from that point on, for me, there was personally no more searching for silver linings, no more, well, maybe Trump is gonna do this and that and actually be tough on Russia. Like, all of that kind of ended for me on the day of the Oval Office meeting, and it's been really dark and cynical since then.
It's also worth noting that there was reporting that the special envoy to Ukraine, who's also supposed to be the special envoy to Russia, but Steve Witkoff took that job, he warned the Ukrainians to not go to the White House. He said, "You're not ready, don't do it." But more than the words exchanged there, let's just take a moment to think about the actions afterward. After that, military aid paused, the intelligence paused. Yeah, it was a week, but nonetheless. So you can say whatever you want, you can have whatever theory you want, but let's also just think about what happened afterward.
Last question.
I'll try to make it a good one. This is going to kind of sound like Monday morning quarterbacking. But obviously with things going on in the current administration and things in the previous administration, up to this point, was there an opportunity to win the war, and maybe either the Europeans or the U.S. hamstring the use of weapons, either didn't allow the Ukrainians to win the war, or is the war winnable now, or is ending the war now at the current stagnant lines the best we're going to get with short of spring break in Moscow?
What do you mean by win the war?
If we define the war, winning the war, as going back to pre-war borders and all of Crimea coming back to Ukraine, right, and then maybe throw in regime change to Russia, right?
That'd be great.
Right? So I
you
guess
guys should get
I think
onto
you
that.
should be up here sitting and.
Can we add a pony to that too, as long as we're doing wish list items?
Sure, why not?
No, it's a deadly serious question, and you're clarifying what does winning actually mean is exactly the right one, because this is that is what it all boils down to. What is the definition of success? I think a fair criticism of the previous administration is that it's very difficult to articulate what success looks like when fundamentally the adversary, Russia in this case, has a maximalist outcome that they're not willing to change. And that's just, it's really hard to end wars even in good circumstances. And when you are dealing with a dictator who has nuclear weapons and no compunctions about feeding hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of his own citizens into a never-ending meat grinder, then that is a very, very, very difficult problem set to try to figure out what does success look like in this situation. And I think the previous administration did its best to try to be realistic about the fact that the only way to ultimately end this war would be some sort of diplomatic process. The key, of course, was going to be that it would be inclusive of Ukraine, and that Ukraine would ultimately be making the decisions about what, if any, concessions it would be willing to entertain, that those decisions would not be made by any external power, including the United States or including Russia, that would be up for Ukraine to try to determine. And that's the fundamental difference between, I think, what the previous administration was trying to do and what the current administration is doing.
If you ask Ukrainian analysts, they will tell you that there definitely was a moment in this war when Ukraine could have won and could have retaken all of its territory. And that moment was the summer of 2022, right after the Battle of Kyiv and right after Russia was arguably at its weakest moment. It was shocked with the fact that there wasn't a victory parade in Kyiv 3 days later, and Ukraine was at its highest morale, and the entire world rallied around us. And I remember that point in time as well, because that's when a lot of Ukrainians believed that it was possible. And it definitely did not turn out that way, because that summer was also the moment when the American administration started this, cycle of telegraphing whether they're going to send this system or that system, and media leaks and extremely long discussions about contingencies in other places and American readiness and so on and so forth. And the American bureaucracy kicked in at that point, and it was just excruciatingly long from a Ukrainian point of view. But I'm pretty sure that if you if you ask Ukrainians, they will tell you that that summer was really a missed opportunity because that's when Russia was at its weakest point and Ukraine was ready to, to do whatever it took to win the war and to defeat Russia.
All right. Sasha, any final words before I say boring final words?
Are mine going to be less boring is the real question. Well, I want to thank the panelists. It was just so fascinating to get your perspectives. And what a way to end it, to think that things could have gone differently in that period of time. I think that Biden had every good intention, and to see where things stand now with the Ukrainians not knowing if they don't engage in the United States proposed peace deal, whether there will still be support moving forward, puts them in a really hard place. So, very sad way to end this panel, but I do appreciate the conversation with everybody, and thank you to the audience for asking such great questions.
I just want to say that there are 21 injured Ukrainians, including 3 kids and a pregnant woman in Kyiv right now, because there's a large-scale attack in the capital, including missiles and drones. This is like literally coming every minute, the news. So just to bring it back to reality again.
And amazing to think about, we're just sitting here, how much happens. And we're safe here, we take it for granted, but
that Article 5 is really good for you if you're in NATO.
Well, our hearts are with you and your people. And Sasha has eloquently thanked the speakers. I want to thank her for being an amazing moderator. Our partners at Goat Rodeo and Lawfare, Tyler. This program will be posted on the Spy Museum YouTube channel soon. Parts of it will become part of a SpyCast podcast from the Spy Museum, which will launch next week. So please listen to that, watch the program, listen to Escalation, the series, if you haven't already. And I want to thank you for being here tonight. It's meant a lot.